The Bible, a text revered by billions, a source of solace and guidance for millennia, but within this vast and intricate tapestry of Scripture, certain passages stand out, verses that make us pause, verses that challenge our understanding, verses that spark controversy. In this exploration, we journey into the heart of 10 such verses. Our goal isn't to shy away from the difficult questions they raise, but to confront them head-on. We'll delve into the historical context, grapple with their complexities, and seek to understand how these verses continue to shape our understanding of faith, morality, and the very nature of the divine. In the ancient city of Sodom, we encounter Lot, a man caught in a terrifying predicament. A mob surrounds his home, demanding he surrender his guests. 2 angels disguised as men. It is in this crucible of fear and chaos that Lot makes an unthinkable offer, a desperate attempt to protect his guests by offering his own daughters to the mob. How are we to reconcile this act with our modern sensibilities, with our understanding of a just and compassionate God? Was Lot's offer a reflection of cultural norms, a sacrifice made in the face of overwhelming threat? Or does it reveal a darker side of human nature, a willingness to prioritize survival over even the most sacred bonds? Some scholars argue that Lot's offer was never meant to be taken literally, but rather as a hyperbolic plea, a desperate attempt to shock the mob into reason. Others suggest that the passage reflects the patriarchal structure of ancient society, where women were often viewed as possessions. Regardless of interpretation, Genesis 19:8 serves as a stark reminder of the complexities of human nature and the ethical dilemmas that have plagued humanity for centuries. Exodus 21:20-21. These verses, etched in the annals of history, address a practice that continues to haunt the human conscience: slavery. The verses lay out a stark reality of the time, outlining punishments for slaves who are injured by their masters. A master who strikes and kills his slave will be punished, but a slave who dies after a day or two of beating, that, according to these verses, is a different matter. How can a God who freed a people from bondage condone such treatment? How can we reconcile these verses with our modern understanding of human rights and equality? Some scholars argue that these verses reflect a gradual attempt to regulate and ultimately abolish slavery, a stepping stone towards a more just society. They point to other passages in the Old Testament that mandate the protection and fair treatment of slaves. Others suggest that the verses should be understood within the context of ancient Near Eastern law, where punishments were often based on the economic value of the victim. Leviticus 20:13. A single verse, a mere sentence, yet it has ignited centuries of debate and fueled countless acts of discrimination and hate. The verse condemns homosexual acts, declaring them an abomination punishable by death. But how are we to understand this verse in our modern world? A world that increasingly embraces diversity and recognizes the inherent dignity of all people, regardless of sexual orientation. Some interpret Leviticus 20:13 as a reflection of ancient cultural anxieties, a fear of practices that challenged traditional societal structures. Others suggest that the verse's condemnation is not about love between consenting adults, but rather about specific acts that were considered exploitative or abusive in the ancient world. Deuteronomy 22:28-29. Deuteronomy 22:28-29 presents us with a scenario that is deeply unsettling, a law that mandates marriage between a rapist and his victim. How can a text that speaks of justice and righteousness endorse such a practice? How can we reconcile these verses with our understanding of consent, agency, and the profound trauma of sexual assault? Some scholars believe that these verses reflect an attempt to protect women in a patriarchal society where they had limited rights and were often blamed for their own assaults. Marriage, in this context, was seen as a means of providing for the victim and ensuring her social standing. Others argue that the verses should be understood within the broader context of ancient Near Eastern law, where rape was often seen as a property crime against the victim's father or husband. Judges 19:24-25, Judges 19:24-25 plunges us into a dark and disturbing narrative, a story of violence, hospitality betrayed, and unimaginable cruelty. A Levite, traveling with his concubine, seeks refuge in the town of Gibeah. What follows is a night of terror as a mob surrounds the house, demanding to rape the Levite. In a desperate attempt to protect himself, the Levite offers his concubine to the mob. She is subjected to a night of horrific abuse and left for dead. Some scholars argue that the story serves as a condemnation of the moral depravity of the time, a stark illustration of the consequences of abandoning God's covenant. Others suggest that the story highlights the vulnerability of women in ancient society, their lack of agency and protection under the law. 1 Samuel 15:3. In the annals of warfare, few commands are as chilling as the one issued in 1 Samuel 15:3. God, speaking through the prophet Samuel, instructs King Saul to wage a war of utter annihilation against the Amalekites. The command is clear: leave no survivors, kill both man and woman, infant and nursing child, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. Some scholars argue that the verse should be understood within the context of ancient Near Eastern warfare, where the complete destruction of an enemy was not uncommon. They suggest that the command was not meant to be taken literally, but rather as a hyperbolic expression of God's judgment against a wicked people. Others contend that the Amalekites represented a real threat to the Israelites, a people who had repeatedly attacked and plundered their settlements. 2 Kings chapter 2 verses 23 to 24. 2 Kings chapter 2 verses 23 to 24 recounts a disturbing incident involving the prophet Elisha. As he journeys to Bethel, a group of young boys mocks him, taunting him about his baldness. Elisha, angered by their disrespect, curses them in the name of the Lord. The consequence is swift and brutal. 2 she-bears emerge from the nearby woods, mauling 42 of the children. Some scholars argue that the story should be understood allegorically, a symbolic representation of the dangers of disrespecting God's prophets. They suggest that the number 42 may have held symbolic significance, representing a generation that had turned away from God. Others contend that the story highlights the importance of respecting religious figures and the authority they hold. Psalm 137 is a lament, a raw and powerful expression of grief and anger. The Israelites, exiled in Babylon, pour out their sorrow over the destruction of Jerusalem, their beloved city. But amidst the tears and cries for justice, a chilling verse emerges, a verse that speaks of unspeakable violence. Happy is he who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks. Some scholars argue that the verse should be understood within the context of ancient Near Eastern warfare, where the killing of infants was a tragically common practice. They suggest that the psalmist is not condoning such acts, but rather expressing the depths of their anguish and rage over the atrocities committed against their people. Others interpret the verse as a prophetic condemnation of Babylon, a warning that their cruelty will be met with divine justice. They point to other passages in the Old Testament that speak of God's judgment against those who harm the innocent. Isaiah 13:15-16. Verses that paint a chilling picture of warfare and its brutal consequences. The prophet Isaiah, in a vision of Babylon's impending destruction, describes scenes of unimaginable violence. Whoever is captured will be run through. All who are caught will fall by the sword. Their infants will be dashed to pieces before their eyes. Their houses will be looted and their wives violated. Some scholars argue that the verses should be understood within the context of ancient Near Eastern prophecy, where hyperbolic language and vivid imagery were often used to convey the gravity of God's judgment. They suggest that the verses are not intended to be taken literally, but rather as a symbolic representation of the consequences of wickedness and rebellion against God. Others contend that the verses reflect the harsh realities of ancient warfare, a time when brutality and atrocities were all too common. 1 Timothy 2:12, a verse that has become a lightning rod in contemporary debates over gender roles and the place of women in church leadership. The verse states unequivocally, "I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet." Some scholars argue that the verse should be understood within its historical context, a time when women often lacked access to education and were relegated to subservient roles in society. They suggest that Paul, the author of 1 Timothy, is addressing a specific situation in the Ephesian church, where women may have been teaching false doctrines or disrupting worship services. Others contend that the verse reflects a broader theological principle of male headship in the church and in marriage. They argue that God has ordained a specific order of authority, with men called to lead and women called to submit. The Bible, in its vastness, challenges us, provokes us, and forces us to confront the complexities of faith and the human experience. These 10 verses, fraught with controversy, are not standalone pronouncements, but threads woven into a larger tapestry of narratives, laws, poetry, and prophecy. To truly understand them, we must engage with them in their entirety, considering the historical context, the cultural norms of the time, and the overarching message of love, compassion, and justice that permeates Scripture. These verses are not meant to be taken lightly or used to justify hatred, prejudice, or violence. Instead, they serve as a springboard for dialogue, for wrestling with difficult questions, and for deepening our understanding of the divine and our place in the world. If you found this exploration insightful, we encourage you to share your thoughts in the comments below.